All right, so we're going to continue our look at the taxes and laws that were passed by the British after the French and Indian War. And so what we're looking at now is kind of the big issues from 1765 to 1770 and how the British tried to govern the colonies. And we're going to start off with the Stamp Act. This is a big deal. This is probably one of the more important laws for you to know. You definitely need to know the Stamp Act of 1765. It's a tax on all printed paper, ship's paper, legal documents, licenses, newspapers, other publications, playing cards even were taxed. The cost of the stamp was actually very, very small. But the purpose was to help pay for the defense of the frontier. So these 10,000 troops that were basically left here from the end of the French and Indian War that are supposed to be a defense of the frontier and also there to stop the colonists from going on past the proclamation of 1763, which they wouldn't be able to do even with 10,000 troops, not even nearly enough. But here the thing is, this is a revenue act, and this is the purpose of this is to raise money. And as we talked about before, the colonists did not think that the Parliament had a right to raise revenue, use a tax to raise revenue from the colonies. Regulating commerce, they somewhat agreed with. They saw that as something that could be done to regulate trade. In other words, a tax that is supposed to kind of influence the way the trade is happening between different colonies. But this doesn't do that. This is an internal tax. It's for raising revenue, both big problems, and therefore there's no taxation without representation. That's kind of the cry of the colonists, is that, hey, you can't do this. We have the same rights as native-born Englishmen. And this is where we start to see the Sons of Liberty are coming about now. Samuel Adams is kind of the most famous and well-known of these people, although it's not like he's the originator completely of this whole idea. There's many people involved in it. He is certainly one of the big leaders in Boston, and that's one of the other things. A lot of this stuff really centers around Boston, but it's not just happening in Boston. There is a lot of response to the Stamp Act, particularly in Boston and around New England, but in other places as well, New York and other places as well. And what you've got is two different groups, really, that are responding to this. The Sons of Liberty, which actually aren't as radical as the mob. And the Sons of Liberty, depending upon who they were sometimes kind of a little concerned about this mob violence that they're seeing break out. But what do I mean by mob violence? Well, what's going on? Well, I mean actual destruction. So in Boston, they go to the person that is, like, it's his job to distribute the stamp. They tear down his house. They go into his, they break windows, they break all sorts of stuff. They destroy furniture. I mean, really expensive, fine furniture, all sorts of things. They just destroy all these things. They probably about $90,000 worth of in his home is destroyed. And that's a huge, I mean, it wasn't $90,000 back then. It was, like a little, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds, but works itself out to about $90,000 in destruction. Drank all the wine out of his wine cellar and all those things, and over the course of several hours just completely destroy the home. That's what I mean by mob destruction. It's not just these, hey, let's burn an effigy. Now, that was usually the start. One night they get together and they have, they all come together and they've got the stamp distributor. They've made an effigy of him, which is kind of like a scarecrow that's made to look like a particular person. And then maybe the governor and anybody else that may be involved in distributing this tax or making sure this tax is enforced. And they'll bring these guys and they'll hang them up there. They may burn some tar underneath them and catch them on fire, or they may pull the hanging effigy down and chop its head off, or do all these things. And when that person is made to look like you, and you're the guy distributing the stamps, that's a little scary. And then the next night, they're out doing other things, and then the next night they're at your house, and they run you out of your house, and they destroy your house. Well, guess what that guy does? Well, he resigns. He's like, no, I'm not doing that. And do you think it's easy for the governor to find a replacement? Nobody wants this job. And this happens in New York, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, and in other colonies as well. Just complete mob destruction. They also begin boycotting British goods, which is a pretty good, is really kind of often their most effective actual way of fighting against these taxes. And then they even organize a Stamp Act Congress to kind of get together and talk about it and say, hey, just let them know this is not what we want to do. But not that many colonies are actually able to attend this Stamp Act Congress. The British do repeal the Stamp Act. They're actually kind of surprised. They didn't realize how violent a reaction there would be to the Stamp Act. And so it was a very violent reaction, but they said, hey, we're going to repeal this, but at the same time they repealed it, they passed the Declaratory Act, which basically declares, that's why it's called the Declaratory Act, it declares we have the right to pass laws that you have to obey in all cases whatsoever. Taxes or any other laws, if Parliament passes them, we have to buy them. You have to pay, obey these laws. And this is really what's starting to happen, is they're starting to say, no, we don't. This is not what we have to do, because they're not going to in many cases, as we see with this mob violence. And there's nothing to stop the mob. There's not enough troops around to stop them. The governor can't send anybody. Nobody's willing to, because these mobs are so large. There's nothing they can do. And so this is a big problem for the British, and this leads to repeal of the Stamp Act, but it's not going to solve all the problems because they're still not done passing taxes. And right along with the Stamp Act is the Quartering Act of 1765. It required colonies to provide housing, not in private homes. That's a common myth that you hear, that the colonists would come in and sleep in the private homes, but that's not true. They slept. The colony as a whole had to provide for the housing, food, drink for the British Army, and actually the amount isn't necessarily that much. But and the colonists expected to do this during wartime. This happened during the French and Indian War. And in some cases, actually, during the French and Indian War, there were soldiers in private homes. But it was wartime. That was somewhat expected. This is after the war is over, and there's still troops here. This is not common back then to keep a standing army during a time of peace in the colonies. They didn't like that. And by passing this Quartering Act, it is a de facto tax, because they're saying, here's the soldiers, you have to pay for these soldiers. Well, that's what it is. It's a tax. And the colonists saw this as, once again, a violation of their rights, this idea of no taxation without representation. And so one example, it kind of escalates a bit in New York. Troops arrive in New York and then may disperse to other colonies, so therefore they have high costs. A lot of the troops are coming into New York, even if they're going to be sent other places. And so while they're there, New York is having to pay for them, and that's causing a higher cost to New York than some of the other colonies. So they actually refuse to pay. The assembly is suspended. Some different political maneuvering goes on, but basically the assembly is reinstated, and they do end up paying for the troops that are being sent there to New York. So that's the Quartering Act. It's just another example of how the colonists and the British are just at head-to-head, not agreeing on how things should be, what should be done in the colonies. And then the last one we're going to talk about here is the Townshend Acts, and this is passed in 1767. So this is kind of really the first big tax that is passed after the Stamp Act is repealed. And they went about it in a different way. They said, okay, the Stamp Act is an internal tax. It was a tax on paper and all those kind of goods that were being created in the colonies. Well, we're going to tax something different here. This is going to be an external tax. It's going to be a tax on imported goods. So taxes on paper that's imported, paint, lead, glass, tea, all these things that are being imported into the colonies is going to be a tax. The problem the colonists have is it is still for the purpose of raising revenue, of raising money, of paying for these things. They didn't believe that Parliament had this right. And so they're now starting to see, and they've already been starting to see through these other acts that have happened, they're starting to see Parliament as no longer a protector of their rights, but also kind of taking their rights away. And whereas before they'd kind of seen the king doing that sometime, well, now they're starting to see not just the king, but also Parliament. And so the response is a boycott. Don't get me wrong, there still continues to be some mob violence and things like that. That stuff continues. But the boycott becomes more organized. It's a non-importation agreement from colony to colony. People are signing these non-importation agreements, and there's there's a lot of public pressure. If you are seen like wearing something that was imported, that was clearly imported, you going down the wrong street, you might get in trouble and things like that. And women are really the ones that have to put this into practice in a lot of ways. So they're the ones that are doing the spinning and weaving, because you're no longer buying any kind of pardon me, excuse me there. You're no longer buying any kind of fabric from Europe or anything like that, or even or not, or especially, I mean, from Great Britain. And so you've got to make these things yourself. And so they're spinning and weaving and sewing and making all these, the dresses and clothes for themselves. And so it becomes fashionable, basically, to wear this homemade clothes. And instead of buying tea, they're buying tea from other places, or they're using like an herbal tea or something like that, maybe using coffee, and replacing all sorts of anything that would be imported from England. They're no longer purchasing these things. And so this is meant to raise money. Well, how much money does it raise over the course of like 3 years, from 1767 to 1770? About 21,000 pounds, which is a significant amount of money, but it doesn't compare to the loss of revenue that the British merchants are facing. They've lost in that time period over 700,000 pounds of revenue. And so the merchants are like, hey, we've got to repeal this thing. And it is repealed, except for the tax on tea, which is kept. And that's going to be kind of the next part that we talk about, the Tea Act. And that's going to be, once we get to that, things really roll downhill. Now, the thing that's interesting about the the Townshend Acts is the day is repealed, there's violence in Boston. A bloody massacre happens in Boston, and we'll be talking about that in the next video.